Started. So again, welcome everyone for getting serious about sustainability. This is about using evaluation to plan, monitor, and celebrate. My name is Andrea De La Flor, and I'm here with Dr. Bill Geary on the session, and
Hi,
he's going to start us off. And take it away, Bill.
Live TV. So this is our 9th one. I don't know if you talked about that, right? And really happy to have all these folks on here. I think right out of the gate, the first thing that I wanted to talk about was that putting this webinar together was a lot more challenging than Andrea and I had thought it would be. Apparently, the area of capacity. I mean, we've been in the field for a long time. Between the two of us, we have almost 30 years of experience. But when you're digging into the research on capacity, it's a little bit different than when you're just kind of developing capacity inventories. It's a very different approach to things. So today we're going to talk about some of the key themes of the research. We're going to talk about defining capacity, which is pretty easy, unlike sustainability last month. But the difficult part of this one was in the predictor side. And we're going to talk about what you can do at your coalition level, assessing and prioritizing. And of course, we're going to talk about what role the evaluator can play, or evaluation can play in helping you do this, right? So here's the basic research. These are the 3 pieces of research that we drew from the most. And I just wanted to make sure that we had those up for the record. And I want to briefly talk a little bit about why we chose these 3 articles. It's very similar to last month's. First, all of them involve some type of community health. Not all of them are prevention coalition, substance abuse prevention coalition work. So we like to have a variety of science, I think, in what we do. So we're addressing more than just substance abuse. But all 3 of them do talk about specific predictors of capacity. They provide different approaches to understanding capacity, which I guess from an evaluator standpoint, a researcher standpoint, means that they have different methodologies involved in how you measure capacity, which I think is important. They all summarize kind of the field, the general findings. And last, of course, they are all scholarly articles, which is important. So some key questions that we're going to talk about. What is capacity is where we're going to start. We're then going to identify from the research what are some of the correlates of capacity. We're going to talk about how you can prioritize certain areas of capacity to focus on, and then how evaluation can enhance the ability to improve capacity. And I just wanted to point out again, as Andrea said, if there are any questions as we move along, please feel free to put them in the chat box. So let's start with the question of what is capacity. And for this one, we went right to the CDC. I tried a whole bunch of different places, but the CDC seemed to make the most sense to me. So generally, it refers to the skills, infrastructure, and resources of individuals, organizations, and communities, right? Capacity is be able to get stuff done. And then, of course, capacity building is your ability to do those things, and pointing out that capacity building is a key strategy for the promotion, delivery, and sustainability of prevention programs. I wanted to use that quote because that goes back to one of the things that I had just mentioned, right? That while we all recognize in general that capacity is important, I mean, we have about 110 people on this call right now. Obviously, you all are thinking that there's some type of importance to it. When we get to the research, we're going to be able to delineate how it is important and why, because capacity is not equal. So the first thing we have to try to figure out is capacity to do what, right? There are multiple ways to view capacity. There are multiple areas of capacity. And one of the challenges that we have, I think, I know that when I started out many years ago as a coalition coordinator, I always thought of capacity as basically one set of interrelated things that we need to do as an organization, right? And there's all kinds of things we need to do. But I didn't give much thought to how they may be interconnected And I certainly didn't give much thought to how different areas of capacity might affect different elements of what the organization is trying to do. And so that's what we're going to try to flesh out a little bit, right? And I put on here to do what? There's a lot of different things. There's capacity to sustain, capacity to evaluate, capacity to engage partnerships, capacity to implement, capacity to change the community, right? Most of you are probably familiar with these and multiple other types of capacity that are out there. The research is a little complicated, so let's talk a little bit about why that is. First of all, there is a lack of control. Obviously, when we're doing anything relating to community level stuff, there are community variables that we can't control. And there are methodological ways that researchers have tried to address this, not just in capacity work, but also in some of the other things we've already talked about, sustainability and all that. And there are also coalition variables, right, that are difficult to control. So just in terms of just doing general research, we've talked about these before in previous webinars. There are complexities there. However, one of the things that gets added to the capacity argument is the topic areas that I just talked about on the previous slide, right? There are various capacity, what I would call various capacity targets in the real world. That is to say that organizations and coalitions are trying to deal with different elements of capacity. So it becomes difficult to come up with a real world study with control groups when you have different folks who are all looking at different things. And also, we're not sure about the relationship between traditional capacity concepts and specific outcomes. There hasn't been a lot of discussion in the research on outcomes relating to capacity. So let's talk a little bit more about that. I found a quote that I think does a pretty good job in one of the pieces that we're focusing on, one of the pieces of research we're focusing on, the Strong article in 2012. They kind of give us the good news and the bad news about research on capacity, right? So the good news, organizational capacity and performance of nonprofits had increased. They did a research study on community health initiatives, CHIP programs, and what they found is that all of them had increased in their capacity. However, at the same time, what they concluded from the research is that there's actually very little research that talks about the relationship between capacity building and actual program outcomes. And for those of you who are doing community-based stuff, again, if you're relatively new to the webinar series, we take the CDC's definition of programs, and that includes community-level interventions. So this is true there as well, right? So what are the community outcomes that are linked to different types of capacity? Strong is summarizing the research here and saying that there's really not a lot of research out there that talks about it. And so that's a big challenge, right? Because that can lead coalitions into this idea that I kind of phrased as capacity for capacity's sake, right? That we're building capacity, and we may even have some understanding of the different kinds of capacity that we're trying to increase, but maybe we're not aware of the research of what kinds of capacity are associated with what kinds of outcomes, either at the program level, small program level, or at the community level, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. And that's part of the purpose of this webinar, right? Is how do we then become strategic about this, given what the state of the data is on capacity, which is minimal conversation around what you're trying to change externally, that is your outcome data. How can we become more strategic about capacity? Well, the way that we do that is we look at the research and we look for elements of capacity that are associated with either program or community level change. And then we have the conversation on how do we focus on those elements. Whoops. There we go. So we're going to start with a study that was done with CTC. For those of you who are familiar with communities that care, or you're familiar with research on coalitions, you probably know that communities that care has a lot of research on it in terms of things like capacity building, sustainability, all of that, and that's primarily because there are some major research hitters out there who are deeply involved or have created, actually, some of them, the communities that care model. So there's a lot of academic research out there on communities that care coalitions. So what we're going to talk about then is what does this research, this piece of research, which was just done in 2015, what does this say about capacity and which characteristics are associated with capacity? So the research identified two key capacity indicators, right? So they tested, I think, 9, but only came up with 2 things in these CTC coalitions that actually they were able to say correlated statistically at a statistically significant level with community level outcomes. And then in this case, the community level outcome that they were looking for was the community engaging in proven prevention, scientifically based prevention programming, right? And that's the level, that's the dependent variable for them. So the first indicator was the acquisition of skills. And when they talked about new skills, I don't know how many folks are familiar with the Communities That Care model, but Communities That Care breaks skills down into certain subsets. And there were 3 subsets in particular that were important for community level outcomes. And so what we're saying is that among these Communities That Care coalitions, there were 3 areas of skill sets that were statistically significantly related to community level outcomes. And they were organization and communication, changing local politics, and designing and carrying out prevention programs. Now, what you see on the screen here is a template that we've devised to help you walk through this, and we're going to get to it in just a second. But I think what's important here, and certainly something that the researchers had pointed out, notice that the variable here is member acquisition of new skills. A separate category that they had assessed was member knowledge, right? Member acquisition of new knowledge. And so what they found is that just providing knowledge to the coalition was not something that was correlated with community level outcomes. What they found was that only by improving or giving coalition members new skills. And before I turn it over to Andrea to go through the template, one last thing about this research is that they accounted for the level of skill that a community member brought into the organization. What I mean by that is it was the actual creation of new skill sets that correlated with community level outcomes. It wasn't just bringing people in who had skills already. So maybe part of that is you may have skill sets that are important that may fit, in fact, into the CTC model, but you would have to know how to apply those skills in a way that fits in with what the coalition is trying to do, right? So I may have skills, but can I apply them in a useful way? That's what the authors are referring to under member acquisition. So one of the things that we thought would be a good idea and helpful for all of you, as we do on every webinar, is give you a leaping off point in terms of, all right, if we know this is true, how can we apply this to the coalition? So I'm going to turn it over to Andrea, who's going to talk about one of the handouts that we've provided. And it probably would be best at this point, you can open these up on your desktop as we go. And this one is the organizational linkage, Oh no, I'm sorry. This is the building skills that matter. So it's called skill building assessment. Is the beginning of that handout. So I'll turn it over to Andrea to talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, so before I talk about the tool and walk you through it, I know that we tend to go a little bit fast sometimes, and so I wanted to make sure that if you all had to kind of take one point or two key points from everything that Bill just said, basically it would be, that capacity has a lot of variables to it. There's a lot of it's dynamic. There's a lot of research out there. A lot of researchers are talking about capacity, trying to measure capacity and understand capacity, which is great, but it's also sometimes a little bit confusing when we, for example, are trying to go through all of that and pull something relevant out of it that will be useful. But there is this study that Bill just is going through right now. It did work with the CTC coalitions, which are all aiming to change programs, practices, and policies in their community. And there's a lot of research on the CTC model. So for those DFC coalitions who are on the call, we really feel that a lot of the research coming out of CTC is very valuable for the work that you do and we do. I do, since I am working with the DFC coalition as a project director right now. So that's important. And right now we just started talking about the fact that this study was trying to make a connection between the elements of capacity that are actually correlated with a coalition's ability to implement and carry out effective prevention programming, which Bill also pointed out. I know, at least for the DFC coalitions, we avoid the word program oftentimes. We talk about community change and strategies and all of that. So we can think about the prevention programming piece kind of in the same way as we think about our implementing effective strategies. So with that said, one of the items or issues of capacity that came out to be very important was the fact that we need to be building our coalition member skills around these different areas, which the tool, hopefully you all will have had time at this point to pull it up and take a look at it. This tool called Capacity Assessment, Building Skills That Matter, speaks to these three areas of capacity that the researchers found to be related to coalition effectiveness. So I just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page here and go ahead and start to walk through this. A little bit of background on this tool is that you can see that there's a number of references at the bottom on page 2, including the research that we just spoke about, that CTC Research that found these linkages, but also some other resources that we found out there because the research itself did not have a tool such as this and unfortunately did not give us access to all the questions that they were asking the coalitions in the research. So we were unable to be able to use a tool that was provided by them, and we had to create our own tool. And so this is basically what we did. And so I'm going to go through the first piece that you have in front of you, and this is about this idea of the organizational development piece. So do we give our coalition members an opportunity to not just sort of be aware of how we can organize our coalition and keep all of the systems and processes in place the way that they need to, but actually have the chance to sort of practice some of these skills. And we went to, again, these resources. You could actually, along with your evaluator, adapt this tool in a way that you found appropriate. And that would be by maybe looking at some other resources out there that tell you the kinds of systems that organizations need to put in place. So what we put here as a sort of a launching point, you'll see, is formalizing, getting practice in actually formalizing some of the rules that the coalition operates and how to proceed with decision making. You know that this is important for coalition structure and organization. also being able to provide input into how the coalition work is going to be distributed. And I know, at least for our coalition right now, and a lot of coalitions that I've spoken with, we're always trying to figure out how to get more people involved in actually doing the work, right? And so, yeah, why not, as coalition leaders, not take on the brunt of trying to figure out how we distribute that, sort of own that, when we could actually go ahead and engage some of our interested members and say, hey, can you help me put a system in place, communication, sort of how our work groups are going to function so that we can get out there and organize and keep people engaged in terms of how they're going to take on some of these things that we need to do. Also, then the next two pieces speak to the communication. I felt it was a little unfortunate in the research here that they were putting these two pieces together. But again, we went ahead and we wanted to sort of replicate the way that they were speaking in the research. So a couple of points that we found that were important for communication are the second two in this tool, which are building people's skills and actually doing some external communication, so developing reports, presentations, newsletters, social media. How well does your coalition do that? And also, we added a piece on thinking about the internal communication skills that you're building for your membership, like the meeting dates coordination, thinking about where and when meetings are going to take place, whether they're your regular coalition meetings or other action team meetings and planning meetings, and actually drafting the meeting agendas and minutes. So you get the idea, but again, just to kind of point out that this is not exhaustive. There's plenty of other best practices for communication. There's plenty of other resources out there that help you determine how best to organize your coalition and its structure. The general idea we wanted you all to take away, is that this is something that we could be sort of working with our evaluators and other people in our community familiar with data and organizing the data to basically just see to what degree are we actually building people's skills. Again, not just informing them of the kinds of processes that take place, but helping them get the chance to actually practice them. That was the important piece in the research. The distinguishing factor was actual practice and application of skills. So let's see, with that said, we have another piece here on the politics. So Bill pointed out this changing local politics. So again, I went to some research out there and resources around what makes for effective policy change. Again, it's not exhaustive, but you can see here we included identifying key policy decision makers and their influencers to have opportunities for members to engage in that. Actually having members write policy messages and determine what those policy messages need to be, maybe having them practice elevator speeches or preparing a written fact sheet, for example. Preparing testimony before a local, state, or federal agency, and then, of course, working with the media. So, I don't want to go through all of these for a long time, but you get the idea. The prevention programs, designing and carrying out prevention programs section, that was the third piece, and this is the evidence-based, again, that Bill was referring to how the CDC talks about programs. So for those of you who are thinking more about the community level change and the strategies that you're working on, I think those two words could be used interchangeably. So I went over to the community, the community toolbox that the University of Kansas has, and I included developing and monitoring the progress and protocols for carrying out the program or the initiative the way that it was planned, engaging in efforts to adapt or tailor that initiative, strategy, or program to meet the needs of all of those people in your community or the people who are going to be affected by the initiative, obtaining written commitments from key partners, so formal commitments, who are involved in designing and carrying out those activities related to the initiative or the program, and supporting efforts to make sure that those people who are involved have the skills and experience, including helping to build their skills. So that is sort of the first kind of jumping off point that I think your coalition could do, that we think your coalition can do, possibly with your evaluator, to just say, okay, where could we be doing a little bit better here? What do we want to focus on? And I think it's definitely going to relate. It definitely will relate back to what it is that you're trying to work on right now. Obviously, if your coalition right now has not prioritized a certain policy change, then maybe you're not going to focus on the policy piece too much, but maybe you'll be able to work with someone, with your evaluator, to build out some additional items that you want to be thinking about, or activities, skill building activities that you want to be thinking about, that based in the research or based in some other resources that you have, are important for that particular issue, whether it is general prevention program activity, or the policy piece, or communications, or just general organizational development. So before we move on, because the second piece is very different, it talks about some different capacity related items, I wanted to be able to offer everyone the opportunity to ask questions. And I do not right now see any questions specifically in the chat. So
if I could just jump in. So Deborah asked if an increase in knowledge was a prerequisite for skill acquisition, or was it not necessary at all? And Deborah, I think I tried to respond to that, but I think it's a good question. They treated those separately. So statistically, they did not include them, did not account for the impact of one on the other. They treated them as two separate variables, though it does seem to make sense, right, that you're going to have some knowledge development prior to skill development. I think their point in the research was that giving people knowledge without changing their skill set, improving their skill set, was not helpful for community outcomes. That it was only by doing the additional step of having folks acquire new knowledge. I think the other thing that's important to remember is how it was tested, since, Deborah, this is obviously that's a methodological question, so I have to answer it methodologically, which is they were self-assessments asking people, did you acquire new skills? And people would talk about how they acquired new skills, or if they thought they did and to what degree they did that. So that was the variable that they connected to the outcomes. So I hope that helps.
One of the other things I was thinking about also is the fact that it's one thing if maybe you have your key staff or board members, let's say, probably more like the key staff are going to have a better understanding of this. But if you have them fill out this, right, versus if you have some of your members fill this out to kind of get some inter-rater reliability. I don't know if maybe Bill, if you have any additional comments about that, but it was just something that I was thinking about that we hadn't actually talked about in terms of sort of what venue you would conduct this assessment in and who would be involved.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the conversation around evaluation and what role the evaluator plays in making sure that you take these very subjective measures, which they are, right? I mean, and that was something that was pointed out in the research as well. I mean, there's a ton of capacity measures out there that you can look up on the internet. But most of them, overwhelming majority of them, have not been validated. And part of that validation process is adding a level of objectivity to that, or else you really have to speak to the limitations of using those kinds of things. So there are things that you can do, as you said, inter-rater reliability. I'm not sure that this is a tool that you really worry about that, because at some level, in the research study that we're talking about, they tried to use more objective measures for some of the variables, which is to say that they interviewed people who were outsiders of the coalition, but were involved at the community level, and was asking them about what they saw in the community. So there was a level of objectivity there. But yeah, absolutely, we have to remember that when we're doing these self-assessment surveys, they are just perceptions, And so we want to be able to draw conclusions based on that limitation. And I think that Steve asked the question about designing and carrying out prevention programs isn't the responsibility of coalition to address environmental strategies, not programs. And that was that's the language that we're using, Steve, because the CDC does not make the distinction, I should say, when they talk about evaluation. They don't make a distinction between what we would refer to as smaller group or micro level programming versus community-wide strategies. They refer to those community-wide strategies also as programs. They're just different kinds of programs. The reason they do that is because the guidelines that they provide for evaluation are the same for both of those, right? For both of those kinds of things. So we're kind of steering away from the lingo where we try to separate out community level versus programming, which typically means smaller, so that we can speak more on the CDC level, that it all is a kind of program. They're just different kinds, right, of programs. But the rules apply the same for both of them.
Right. So when filling this out, and feel free to change the language if it makes, because it probably would make more sense to the people that you have completing it in your coalition. If you're a DFC coalition, for example, you could certainly make any modifications to this tool that you wanted. Some of the tools that we've provide are a little bit more, I guess you could say, static, and they're sort of ready to go and sort of be finished. But this one doesn't work like that. This one really is just sort of the guideline. It's a way, it's an opportunity to kind of provide you with a starting point, a framework, a beginning tool that you could sort of make some of your own modifications to in collaboration with your evaluator, for example, or somebody who's just familiar with some of the research around these issues, but we wanted to give you a starting point. So it's completely okay for you to, for example, for this one in front of us that we're looking at, developing and monitoring progress and protocols for carrying out the coalition activities and strategies, or strategies and activities, or the coalition, specific coalition goals and objectives, for example. So feel free to make some modifications there. And let's see if we have anything else, any other questions before we continue. We just had a comment from Deborah Beck that says that there's a lot of research to show that a shared knowledge is a prerequisite to moving forward as a group, but knowledge itself doesn't usually change personal or institutional behavior.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk about that some more, because one of the research studies that we look at talks about training and technical assistance. I think that's a really important point to bring up here. I might as well bring it up here. Is that when we're talking about skill acquisition, there is research where we have folks that are trying to provide skills to coalitions. And what we found is that kind of the traditional model, and I say traditional because it's the one that I think, well, CTC certainly used at some level. I think it's also the level that CADCA primarily uses, right? Which is you basically train a couple of people, right? I know that the University of Kansas did this, and this was out of their study. So you train a couple of people, you provide for them skills, and what you do is you then send them back to their coalitions, and then they are supposed to transfer that information to the coalition, right? And so what we seem to be finding in the research, if we look at all the research that's put together, is that model is obviously, Deborah will not be surprised by this, right? It's less impactful than training or providing skills directly to the entire coalition or the majority of coalition members, right? There's a difference there. And the difference, of course, is that if you train a couple of people, then send them back to the coalition, the mechanism for change then falls in the lap of the people who have been trained and who are then going to try to pass that along. Their skill set in being able to do that is going to vary widely, and it's random. So we actually don't know what kind of skill sets the coalition will acquire if you only train a couple of people. right? And again, it's not judgmental. This is what the research is telling us, and it does seem to fit in with common sense. Some of the idea of this model where you only train a couple of people, of course, is due to limitations of resources. I think the question is, what can you do with that knowledge? How do you overcome that? Yes, absolutely. So you want folks in the coalition to be getting the skill acquisition directly from the people who, I guess, are best at providing it. Absolutely. And then one last question before we move to the second one. Hi, Tracy. She's asking if anybody would recommend that this be administered annually. And I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think as part of, and we'll talk about the role of the evaluator, but I think as part of a good evaluation, this certainly should become part of the process evaluation. There are already measures. If you're a DFC, which I believe, Tracy, you are or were at one point, but if you're a DFC and you have mandatory reporting requirements, you're a SPIF-SIG, you have mandatory reporting requirements. Most grants, right, you have some type of mandatory reporting. They have process outcomes built in some vague way. And we'll talk about one of them in a second. But this is just a way, I think, of really sharpening the blade on that and looking at those capacity elements, that being thoughtful about the capacity elements that in the research have been demonstrated to have an impact on your community outcomes. And so, yeah, I think doing something like this does a couple of things. One, I can't help but think it's going to be good for sustainability, right? Because we talked about sustainability last time, making sure that we're meeting people's needs, making sure that people are comfortable with the roles that they're in. This kind of questionnaire helps get to that. But then again, it also helps identify the areas of capacity that are most important, and are you focusing on those that are linked to community outcomes? So I would definitely recommend it once a year.
And Tracy also made a comment, everybody, about if anyone has taken a stab at making this closer to a 5th to 6th grade reading level. That is a very important point. So this is Andrea again, and I was the one who put this together based on some resources that I cobbled together based on the research that Bill has been sharing. So, it's not a validated instrument. We would say that it's research-based, research-guided, at least the process and these 3 sections that we would be focusing on. So certainly, for example, I would be able to recognize that if you had some needs to modify, I would recognize that there is probably a need to modify, let's say, make a little bit more basic some of the language in here. And if I were giving this out in my community, I'm sure I would get a comment like that, and we'd probably need to work together to do that.
Yeah, and then we'll talk about that at the end, right? That's part of the role of making sure that your instruments are meeting your audience, right? So we always want to do that. And yes, this is science driven, but in no way, no way validated.
It hasn't been tested yet by people like you who would say, that doesn't make sense, or that, I don't understand that, or so, that's something that we would want to do if we were going to put this in place in a community. So thank you for all your comments and questions. We're going to go ahead and move on. I'm going to pass it to Bill, and he's going to talk about another important indicator.
Yeah, so the other indicator, remember there were 2. It seems like it was such a long time ago that I brought up the first one. But there's a lot there, right? This gets complex very quickly. We get deep in the woods around capacity and skill acquisition. We may have to do another webinar on different elements of capacity. But the other indicator on this CTC study was what they referred to as organizational linkages, right? And so I don't know if anyone is familiar with what's called social networking analysis, but this certainly leads into that. The CTC study was not a social networking analysis, but one of the other research projects that we describe is. So we're going to bring that into play. I just wanted to quickly talk about how they did this. What they did was they asked coalition members to rank sector involvement. And the sectors that they looked at, I just wanted to list them. For those of you who are involved in community projects, this probably looks pretty familiar to you. And in fact, we did a cross comparison with the DFC 12 sectors that you have to have. And the only two that were really different, I mean, this list is slightly different because it, for example, distinguishes between elected leaders and unelected leaders, right? Unelected leaders is not one of the DFCs, and recreation officials, the last two that are on this list, are not DFC, but pretty much everything else is. And if you're involved in community work, this list is very familiar to you. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to look at the strength of these linkages and then draw conclusions about the impact. And what they found, in fact, is the more linkages that these CTC coalitions had, the more likely they were impacting community level change. So let's talk a little bit about some of the social networking analysis, though, that provides some other information that you would probably need before you started running down this road and doing this kind of analysis, right? For those of you who have never seen it before, this graphic is out of the research study that we're going to talk about right now. It is a kind of a traditional networking analysis. It makes my head hurt just looking at it. And we're certainly not going to explain it, but just wanted you to know what it looks like, what one kind of network analysis looks like, right? So on the research from social networking analysis, in terms of examining the impact of social networks on community level change, there are a couple things that we found out, right? So one of them is the perceived value of the coalition correlates with the number of non-redundant ties. So there's a lot there, and let me just walk through those kind of quickly. The researchers were interested in looking at how valuable the coalition was perceived by community members, right? Did community members think that the coalition had value? These are community members that are not involved with the organization, as well as those who are involved. And what they found was that those coalitions that had the highest numbers, just a sheer count, how many linkages do you have, that were non-redundant, right? So it is a true count. So you don't have like one person who knows everybody, and then there's like 10 people who know all the same people, right? That's not how this works. It's the greater number that you have, the better off you are in this framework, right? In terms of perceived value. However, they also pointed out that there is a point, and I wish I could tell you what it is. I don't know what the dosage is because they don't know. Again, there's not a lot of research on this part either. In fact, I only found one research study, the one that we're talking about, that actually talked about this diminishing returns phenomenon, which is you have a certain number of linkages, or what we'll refer to as partnerships, right? And that as you're creating new partnerships, this increases your effectiveness to get to community level change. But then there's a drop off point in value that once you have a certain number of linkages, you get less and less from having those linkages. And so this is something that obviously we talked about once we came up with, and Andrea, I think, came up with the good idea that if you have a ton of partners, it's hard to keep tabs on everybody, and it's hard to organize the work if you have too many people, right? So maybe that's where that diminishing returns come from. I wanted to bring it up before we get to the next tool, because it's important to remember that on the one hand, while it's very important to know kind of the more partnerships you have, the better, that's only true up to a certain point at which it's going to start to drop off in terms of your ability to be effective. So it's not just about the numbers, right? It's also about being strategic on the kinds of partnerships that you're going to develop. So for some of you, I hope that I'm not creating any stress by showing this to you. I know that there are many DFC people who have something that they have to fill out soon. But the reason I wanted to point this out is, I refer to this slide as obviously assessing linkages 101, right? So at a very basic level, if you are collecting any information at all for your funder, and this is again is a DFC snapshot, where they ask people to just basically rank the involvement of each sector, right? And is it high, medium, low, whatever, right? So at some level, DFCs, anyway, are already responsible for this kind of analysis that talks about linkages, right? Um, the hope is what we wanted to do is we wanted to create a tool that would help you fill this in a little more objectively, right? And so that's where we wanted to go with this. So I refer to it as a do-it-yourself link analysis or social network analysis, right? And it involves a few steps, right? So first is we're going to do a self-inventory, which we're going to talk about in a minute, right? You have to have people basically talk about who are they involved with. Then you want to take all that data together and you want to put it into a database that represents the coalition, right? So you're going to have individuals who are going to track their own linkages, and then they're going to take that information and put it into a broader database so that you can track what the coalition is doing. And then the last part is really, I think, where you may need a lot of help from someone who is comfortable in this area, and that is analyzing and planning, right? So what I want to do is I'm going to turn it back over to Andrea, who's going to talk about a couple of the tools, and then we're going to talk about the role of the evaluator.
Yes, so what you have here in front of you is the step 1 that Bill was referring to, which is basically just getting people together either in a meeting setting in person, or maybe even making a SurveyMonkey online survey and sending that out to your membership, asking them for some additional information. Maybe it's something that you're going to integrate into some processes such as orientation and sort of a sign up of new members onto your coalition. Maybe it's something that you can begin to track every time someone new joins, and something that maybe you would then update, decide maybe with your evaluator how often you want to ask folks to do this again, to update if there are any changes. But basically what you see here is just, again, a tool that we put together that gives you the chance to ask your members to let you know not just what, again, we know there are a lot of DFC coalitions on the line, so not just sort of what DFC speaks to as far as sectors, what sector or they have a connection with, right? We know what sector they might primarily represent. For example, you have a law enforcement person, okay, they're the law enforcement sector, this police is law enforcement sector. But what else are they, how else are they involved in the community in terms of with other organizations and other agencies? So it might not, on the face of it, they're just law enforcement, right? But are we sort of utilizing their networks and their relationships to the degree that we could be? And are we, like Bill said, when we're tracking the information that may be requested of our funder, this sort of basic level of information, are we digging a little bit deeper so that we can see a better picture? Are we missing something? And I think we are missing something when we're just taking a look at the primary sector that this person represents and not trying to get a better sense of, not just in conversations, you know that this person is engaged with such and such agency, but in a way for us to track that and therefore incorporate it into our evaluation. We created a score key, and I have to say that this was something that Bill and I had some conversation going back and forth in terms of sort of how we wanted people to conceptualize this is subjectively for each of them to think about their relationships. So I'll just take an example. I'll just take me as an example right now. So obviously when I am with my coalition, I represent NHS Cares. That would be at the meeting, that's my primary organization or agency. But if I also am at the YMCA, and I know a number of people there. I go there a lot. So I would then put YMCA, and I would think about, okay, so I know a couple of people who run some programs at the YMCA and maybe have some influence. So let's say there's 2 people I'm thinking about in my head, and what degree could those people actually influence or make an impact in our coalition's work? Like, are they a key decision maker? could they help bring in somebody new? And so I would just then subjectively try to determine, one, I have no contact or ability to influence. Actually, you know what? I need to make an edit. I'm sorry. We're going to get rid of the 0. You're going to just, and we'll give it back to you. We're going to want to just have a 1, minimal contact or ability to influence, 2, a substantial contact or ability to influence within this organization or agency, or 3, high contact or ability to influence. The reason that obviously we're going to get rid of the 0 and get that back to you is because this person is going to be listing the organizations or agencies that they're involved with. So there's going to be a 0 of no contact there. So I apologize for that. So basically you're just going down the line. If I'm a member of, let's say I'm friends with the police chief as a member, I have really high contact with like one person who's really influential. I wanted to make sure in this key that, it wasn't just about sort of how many people I knew in the police department, but if I had in my mind that I'm really close with the chief and his family, then I wanted that to be represented. I didn't want coalitions to miss that while this was just one person that they knew in the police department that maybe they saw every few months, that there was like a really deep personal relationship with a high level influencer. And this would allow them, the coalition, to go back to this person and say, you know what, I know that you're part of this particular sector, like law enforcement, but I really had no idea that you had the ability potentially to have a high level of influence with somebody in our school, for example. Tell me a little bit more about that. So that's kind of what we're getting to here. It's just basically making that list and inventory to get everything on paper so that you can get prepared to enter it into a database that I'm going to walk through, that you can then track it and keep tabs on it over time. So that brings me to after that step, right? You've got all the information, you've got all the papers or papers in combination with a survey that you ask people to fill out online, and now you have a bunch of data, right? You've got a bunch of different organizations and agencies that are beyond the general broad sectors. Maybe some agencies, specific agencies and organizations people listed that weren't even on the coalition's radar. So that's important, right? And it might, so you might end up, let's say, having 20 specific agencies in the community based on what unique ones, based on what your membership shared with you. And so what you're looking at right now is just an example of what the database that you would put together would look like. There's 12 different organizations or agencies, which means that in this example, a bunch of members listed who they represented, and there were only 12 unique ones. If you had 20 unique ones, you would list out each one that was mentioned you specifically and keep a running tab, because you might end up with a new member. First of all, some members might repeat that same exact agency, or you'll have a new member coming in that is a part of that particular agency. You'll add that to the tally. Maybe a new member coming in will mention another agency that they're connected to that hasn't been included, and you will want to add another column to that. So a lot of people don't like spreadsheets, don't like dealing with databases. We're coalition evaluation, so we are always talking about monitoring tools that you can use, but we completely recognize that just even thinking about this and looking at this right now might not be your forte or something you're interested in. And so therefore, we really recommend that at this stage you're working with somebody who enjoys working with this kind of thing, somebody you are already paying to do this kind of thing, like your evaluator, and having a conversation with them about how you can track this. But the idea here, as we filled out some examples of some people that you probably know, J.J. Abrams, Jack Black, and Meryl Streep, we just filled out the sample data so that we could show you that basically you're looking at adding up all of these scores that they gave you, whether it was, and again, this is where the zeros come in. They have, you have this organization in a column because somebody else mentioned it, but J.J. Abrams isn't a part of it. So you would just enter 0. But you would add up all of the 1s, 2s, and 3s, come up with a row score, and then you have your column scores, right? So you're looking at both being able to compare individual organizational linkages, or the breadth of the organizational linkages for that individual across members. So you can say, oh, in this case, J.J. Abrams, you seem to have more, and it's just, again, a place where you can say, let's talk about that. I want to get to know more about how you have such a strong local TV linkage, or who you know on the police department, because maybe you did not know that J.J. Abrams had that connection. So the whole purpose of the row scores is just to get a sense of, who has more connections, who has fewer connections, and then on the column scores, you're looking at, okay, now that we've sort of mapped out all of these organizations and agencies that people have mentioned, where do we have more relationships? Where do we have fewer? And based on what we're doing, because again, like Bill said, you're not just going to be trying to reach out and have, your hands in every single agency in the community, but based on what we're trying to do, would the hospital, for example, be someone that we really want to get involved with? Or YMCA, is that going to be useful, the relationships for a particular strategy that we are currently prioritizing? And if so, then maybe we need to increase our relationships with the YMCA and talk to J.J. Abrams about his relationship, if it was hard. So I know that just all sounds kind of, it's very detailed stuff to be thinking about, but I really do think that this could be useful as long as you have someone who, again, enjoys working with this data and understands how to take a look at it. Because once you're able to compare people and compare sort of these agency connections, you can then, and take a look at your action planning, you can then begin to figure out what it is that you want to be working on in terms of reaching out to new people. So I think that that's pretty much all that I wanted to say there. As we've been sort of having everyone do, let's see if we have any questions. But if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat box. Someone asked about the handouts being emailed out, and we will, and I am going to make a small edit, like I mentioned, to the one tool and get rid of the 0 and then hand everything out to people. Again, send everything out in an email. I think that covers that. Bill's going to jump in and talk about sort of the role of the evaluator in assessing this information that you're collecting and helping your coalition to actually use it for improvement.
Right. So thanks, Andrea, for walking through that. And yeah, I think actually, as an evaluator, somebody doing this a while, I like that database idea because there's a lot you can do with rows and columns in terms of keeping track of who you're working with and, do you want to be working that way? I think it also speaks to this idea of too many connections, right? So you may find that for example, you may find that as the number of partners, I guess, increases, the number of columns increases, it's possible that, the mean score for each person might start to decrease a little bit, right? So you want to keep an eye on things like that because that'll tell you if you're maybe overreaching. And those are the things that an evaluator can help with. So let's talk a little bit about kind of what the role of evaluator is. It's very similar to the sustainability one, right? So first of all, it's identifying indicators you're already collecting for capacity because, we both, Andrea currently is a coalition person, right? And I used to be, so we understand that we just don't want to throw more stuff your way and give you tons more stuff to do. So it's what's the kind of data that we're already collecting that might speak to some of the issues that we have been talking about during the webinar. We certainly want to be able to focus our evaluation efforts and our monitoring efforts on those capacity indicators that are associated with community level outcomes, right? So we want to make sure that we have someone who's keeping an eye on the research as it comes out. Believe me, it's not a flood. So you wouldn't have to have somebody that checks it every week. But yeah, if there's new research that comes out that starts talking about the link between capacity and community level outcomes, it's pretty good to have somebody who has their finger on the pulse of that so they can help you make adaptations as necessary. Also, of course, assessing the current level of analysis that people are involved in. As Andrea said, that we called that assessing linkages 201, right? That database is a little more complex than what the DFC asks for, right? The DFC, I mean, you could almost just make those numbers up. Like you could just sit in front of the computer and go, okay, this is a 3, this is a 2, whatever. So an evaluator can help figure out kind of how much work will it be to add on to what we're doing here, and what might the resource cost be of doing that. Helping identify key missing indicators, right? So maybe we're not tracking our collaboration hardly at all, right? Or maybe we're not tracking our capacity efforts around communication and organization at all. Certainly, there is research that indicates maybe we should start thinking about how we're going to do that. We also want to make sure that we're using valid, reliable data collection tools. As Tracy pointed out, part of that is making sure that we have data collection tools that match the needs and match the level of the people who are going to be using them, right? And so evaluators can help do that. And of course, this piece that Andrea had just talked about, I know that when we were designing this database, I looked at it and was easily came up, my brain got flooded with all the things that I could do with it just off the top of my head, right? And that's simply because of my experience in working with these kinds of databases. So as an evaluator, right, part of my job is this is where I refer to the art of evaluation, and that we should be able to look at this kind of stuff and make recommendations, not both in terms of what the coalition needs to do next, maybe, but also in terms of how could they be looking at this information. Are there things that I can pass along as an evaluator to certain folks in the coalition who might have interest in this topic, so that we can start brainstorming ideas? That it's not just up to me as an evaluator to do this, but it's also up to maybe some key staff, key leaders to do that as well. But definitely making recommendations based on this data. And then the last one is designing reports that are useful, right? Something that will help bring folks to the next level. And those are for the most part, those are pretty standard what you'll get from us in terms of the role of the evaluator. We just fine tune it to this. So again, you're standing on the starting line, now what, right? And we're going to start in the same place we did last time. First is getting an evaluator to talk to staff or to key coalition members about the kind of data that you have, right? Or is there more data that you may need on certain elements based on this research? And then how can you use the existing data and the existing forms and templates you're already using? Because we don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. Do we have to make adaptations? While we said our stuff is scientifically driven, right? It hasn't been validated. And I don't know that you need to go through a validation process per se, but you at least want to introduce some level of objectivity into this process if you can. Certainly, you're going to gather coalition and community views. Is it worth sustaining these data collection tools that you're using? You certainly want to be able to do that. And you want to be able to create a climate of, as always, right? It's always the same thing. Create a climate of openness with the coalition so that you can have these conversations with them. Last few tips on this. First, this seems to be different than what I have. So the first one that I have is to be strategic. Avoid capacity building for the sake of capacity building is one of them. Be consistent. Capacity building today means better results tomorrow. And then be inclusive, right? Which is providing skills for everyone in the coalition. We talked about that idea of if you train just 2 people as opposed to training the entire coalition, or you provide skills to 2 instead of the entire coalition, then you will run up against potentially some more issues around your effectiveness, right? So I do want, I see what happened. They went in different order. Okay. So what we did, we introduced key themes of the research, defined capacity, identifying predictors. We talked about some tips in terms of monitoring, which some of us call evaluation. And then we talked about the role of evaluation and evaluators. This was a lot of information, I think, that we spit out today. Some of it may be closer to home for some of you than others. So I certainly want to urge folks, if there are questions, you can either ask them now or you can email us later on this. But in the absence of that at this point, please feel free to either raise your hand or write stuff in the chat box. Our next webinar is going to be on Valentine's Day, which we thought might be a lot of fun. Maybe not. Yeah, there's nothing like attending a webinar on Valentine's Day with the person that you love. So please invite your significant other to participate. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. These things are all housed there, along with other training videos. And also, please don't forget to request a webinar topic, share a success story. And that includes if there are things on this webinar that you thought were confusing, you'd like a little more information on, questions on forms as you have the chance to look at them. I know that we put a lot of information out there for you right now. Some of you, maybe your head's swimming a little bit. But as you try to use these, or as you think about this a little bit, please feel free to reach out. All of these topics at this point are all requests from folks on previous webinars. We're not creating any new topics at this point. So please keep that going, right? Keep that going. We want to make sure that we're addressing your needs. So that's all I have. Andrea, anything?
Yep, that's all I have. Thank you so much for participating. And you know, Bill and I, we don't have any questions right now in the chat box, but except for how do you subscribe to the YouTube channel? Yay! And Lauren, thanks for asking. When we send out some of the edited materials, the PowerPoint slides and all of that in the next day or so, we will have information in that email that will tell you how to subscribe. So
I could just make a commercial, Lauren, just so you know. Right now, the reason we can't give you an easy answer to that is because YouTube gives us a link, which is just a bunch of gobbledygook. It's just a bunch of letters and numbers and stuff like that. But if we get 100 subscribers, we can actually then call it. It'll actually be YouTube/coalition evaluation. So
we have about 80 right now.
Yeah, we're almost there. So if folks getting on board, the only thing you need is you need a Google account to get on YouTube, because of course Google owns YouTube, and then you just hit the subscribe, look us up, but we'll send you the link. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. Bill and I will kind of hang on the line just to see if anyone else has any other questions while people are leaving. And if anyone wants to raise their hand and talk with us, we're happy to open up the line. So thank you again.